Welcome in. Happy Monday. It's going to be kind of a short day today. This is a pretty short lesson. Interactive programs. All right, so we're going to spend Monday upgrading functions. By today, we should be a little comfortable with the. Oh, hold up. I got a question in the Zoom chat. Let's see. Joe, wondering about the HTML weather project and how to list the 7-day forecast on multiple lines. Oh, sure. Let's see. How do we list the 7-day forecast on multiple lines? So let's just go to that real quick before we start the new lesson. So, one of the requirements is in this cell, there are forecasts that are on multiple lines. I recommend using something called a break, right? A BR. So pretty much you can do something like let me go to the lesson on HTML. Towards the bottom, there's something on breaks. So you can pretty much do the 7-day forecast, but with breaks in between, which put a new line. So yeah, that's one way you can do it. Is that clear, Joe? Yeah, some people use yeah, cool, yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's just one way. Some people did it in a list. Some people did it in a numbered list. But if you want to do it properly, it would be breaks, right? Line breaks. And yeah, after class, feel free to share screen with me if there's any debugging issues. I'd be happy to take a look. Anyways, uh, let's jump back into today. So by now, we should be comfortable with functions, right? Writing small functions and using them over and over again. You'll have some practice in the robot cat and also the lab, right? Because today we're gonna do interactive programs, which is a way of upgrading our functions. Currently, whenever we run a function, we have to call it over and over again. But today we're going to see how to wrap the function, right, and have it run it for us. It's going to be pretty cool. Right? It's going to be pretty cool. There's going to be something called event-driven programming. Event-driven programming means that the program is waiting for something to happen. And when it happens, it'll update some stuff. All right, so we're going to upgrade some functions today. Let's kind of do a review, right? I want to make sure everyone is comfortable with functions. One reason is because the midterm is in a couple more weeks. The midterm is right here, by the way. It's on March 21st. So this one, there's going to be like 6 or 7 questions, and they're all going to be write a function that does something. Right? So I want to make sure people are all comfortable with writing those functions, and also, programming. The majority of programming is building blocks and putting them together, right? So building functions and putting them together later. So let's make sure we're all comfortable. Let's do a quick review. So I'm gonna make a brand new notebook and do some small functions and then upgrade them. So I'm just gonna open up a sneak peek. This is gonna be a brand new notebook. I'm just gonna use it as a scratch pad. So I'm gonna call this, I'm gonna call it interactive sneak peek. Right, the goal of this notebook is to write small functions and upgrade them later. Right? The upgrade will give us a sneak peek into the lesson. Okay. We might have seen last week we were writing small functions, right? We started off with a function, I think it was like a greet, right? We wrote a function that was called greet, and I think it took one argument. Right? It can be named whatever. I'm just gonna say name, and we did something like use that to print it, right? Like hello name, and then this is probably an F string because I'm interpolating the variable, right? So we run this, and we can invoke the function. Right? We can invoke the function by saying greet and put some variable in here. Right here, I'm just going to hard code a string. Right, greet Bob. Right, and once again, we can invoke the function over and over again and just call it different times, right? Charlie, right? So then we're invoking it 3 different times. So the takeaway here is we wrote a function and we're invoking it 3 times, right? In the future, in the very near future to today, we're going to upgrade this function where we don't have to invoke it manually. Right? We're going to wrap this whole function in something called a widget. Right? It's going to be an interactive widget that we can kind of click on. We can type in it. Okay, it's going to be pretty cool. So yeah, so stick around. But before I upgrade it, I just want to talk more about like the basics of functions. So in the midterm, there's going to be a prerequisite for each function. They should all have at least a docstring, right? A docstring for minimum credit. Right? A docstring is a comment. It's a comment that describes what the function is doing. Right? So in this case, it's a little redundant, but I'm just going to write it in anyways. Like the purpose is to greet greet a name, right? And then there's one argument or input, right? It's name, the string to greet, and that's it. There's no outputs, no return values. I mean, so there's a docstring. Okay, let's move on to a different function. All right, we're gonna upgrade this later. It's gonna be pretty cool. Okay, I'm gonna write another function. Let's see. Maybe let's do something with 2 arguments, right? So this function has 1 argument. Let's do something with 2 arguments. In a couple assignments, you'll see something called mad libs. So let's kind of give a sneak peek into that. All right, let's say we're writing a function like called poem. I'll just call it mad libs poem. Right? Remember, the point of mad libs is to supply some input, and then the output will be a story. Right? Well, once again, I brought this up a couple times, but for folks who might have played this in elementary school, uh, this is a book of stories, and each story has a bunch of blanks. You would ask another player to fill in the blanks, and then you would read out the story. Right? So let's do something very similar. Right? Let's say that we have a poem with 2 inputs. Right? Maybe some adjectives. Right? So I'll just put like adjective 1, adjective 2. Right? So let's say there's 2 blanks, and we want the user to supply those blanks. And the point of this function would be to produce a story. Right? So I'm just gonna write a very short story. Right? Like roses are blank. Right? And then violets are blank. Are Okay, so these are blank so far, right? They're not defined yet until we invoke the function. Right, so let me just load this function in. Okay, there it is loaded. Let's invoke it now. So Mad Libs poem, right, would take 2 arguments, right? It could be any string you want, right? So let's say you're asking your friend, hey, tell me an adjective, right? And maybe they say big, right? Big is an adjective. And let's say you ask your friend again, hey, what's another adjective? So then you can say, maybe they're going to say like, let's see, what's an adjective? Small. Small is an adjective. All right, so when we run this, these 2 inputs will substitute into here and then produce this following poem. Right, roses are big, violets are small. All right, and once again, you can run this over and over again. Right, like maybe use red and blue. Right, and then now it's producing 2 different poems. All right, so we're going to upgrade this function later. Right, it's going to be pretty cool. Let me just put a docstring in here real quick. It's the minimal requirement for a lot of the exam questions. So let's see the outputs, or it doesn't really output, it prints a poem with given adjectives. Right, and there's 2 arguments. There's adjective 1, which is a string, and then adjective 2, another string. All right, let's do the doc string real quick. Okay. All right. Let's do one more function, and then we're going to upgrade all of these in just a bit, right? Or not really upgrade, we're going to wrap them. Yeah, I'm going to do one more function. Let's say we wanted to calculate a BMI, right? So for folks who are not sure what BMI is, it's the body mass index. This is something that you might have calculated before. It pretty much, here, let me look at the wiki real quick. So the body mass index is a value that's coming from your weight and height. Right? Basically, this value can help doctors understand things. So you'd put in your weight and height, and it will tell you your BMI, right? So for example, let me bring up a BMI calculator. All right, so here's the online calculator. I'm just going to input my height and my weight. All right, so I think I am 5'6", and then I weigh like about 130. So my BMI is 21, right? 21, meaning that I am normal. Okay, cool. So let's write a function that takes two inputs and returns the BMI. So there is a formula for it. If we're using the US metric system, it's going to be this formula right here, right? It's going to be your pounds divided by your inches squared, and then multiplied by this 703 constant. Right, so let's write a function that takes those two inputs and outputs the BMI. So I'm just going to define a function called calculate BMI. Right, once again, it takes two inputs. Right, if we look at the formula, it takes the weight and the height in inches. Okay, so I'll go weight and then height, right? And then let me just doc string it real quick so folks see what it's going to do. Calculates BMI given weight in pounds and height in inches. Now there's two arguments, right? Two inputs. There's the weight, which is, we can probably use a float, right? A float, and then height, another float. And then it's gonna return something, right? It's gonna return the resulting BMI calculation. All right, let's go ahead and write that. So I'm just gonna store in a variable called result, right? Result is equal to the formula, right? Once again, the formula is weight divided by height times 703. Oh, the denominator here is squared. So let's get that in. All right, so it's gonna be weight divided by height squared, right? And you might remember that we can square using this power operator. But basically, two asterisks means that we're going to exponentiate. Right? So it's height to the second power. Right? And then finally, it's multiplied by the 703 constant. So I'm just going to go 703 times this whole thing. Right? That is the resulting BMI. And we should return it. Right? This way, the user can have access to that number. So I'll go ahead and return result. Okay, there we go. So we just wrote the function. Let's go ahead and test it. All right, so I'm going to test it by invoking it. Calculate BMI. Okay, I'm just going to put in two numbers. Let me just put them as variables, just so it's more readable. So let's see, my weight is 130 in pounds. And then my height is 66 inches. All right, so then we can go ahead and calculate the BMI, which is my weight and then my height. Right, so then these numbers will get substituted into this function, and it should return 20.98. Yeah, and that looks about right. because I can double check with this calculator. Right, this calculator produced 21, which is pretty much the same thing. It's just that this is a little more precise. All right, so this is just a warm up into functions. Right? Folks should be able to write these functions by now. So, let's upgrade these functions. This is going to be a sneak peek into interacting with event-driven programming. Right? Event-driven programming means that the program is going to wait for something to happen, and then when that thing does happen, it'll update something. Right? So here, let's upgrade it. So going back to the greet function, right? The very first one we wrote, all it does is it takes one input and then it just prints it back out. Right? That's all it does. So there's something really cool. Right? Let me import something real quick. So I'm going to make another cell at the very top. Okay, at the very top, I'm going to import some widgets. So I'm going to import something called IPyWidgets. All right, this is a library that will embed widgets into your Jupyter Notebook. Right? This is typically Jupyter Notebook exclusive, but it can work in like static HTML pages and other pages as well. Right? But for now, let's deal with Jupyter Notebooks. So I'm just going to run this cell, IPyWidgets. Okay, and here's a cool part. Right? So underneath this invocation, I'm gonna wrap the function with an interaction function. And so we imported something called IPyWidgets. Right? This library has a class function. Right? So IPyWidgets, there's a class function called interact. All right, so this is gonna be pretty cool, right? So interact, and it's gonna take some amount of arguments. Right? The first argument represents the function that we are going to wrap. Right? So let's wrap this greet function. Right? So I'm going to wrap it. I'm going to put greet in here. Okay. So we're going to interact with the greet function, right? But then there's going to be a couple. There's going to be one more argument here, right? The next argument represents the input that we're going to be using. Right? So the input to greet is a name. Right? So name. Right, there it is, name. And typically we would set it equal to something. Right? So I'm just going to set it equal to a empty string for now. Right? This is going to make sense in just a bit, but this is pretty much saying interact with the greet function and use the name, use an empty string as the name input. Right? So okay, let's run this. Right? It's going to be pretty cool. So I'll run it, and we see a widget here. You see this widget? It pretty much allows us to type stuff in, right? Like I could type in Bob, and we see that this print statement gets updated. Right? So this is a event-driven programming. Right? This widget is waiting for something to happen. Right? So if I type in Alice, right, something happened, so it'll call the greet function for us. Pretty sick, right? And then we can keep updating it. Charlie. All right, there we go. And typically this is displayed. You don't have to display it, but I'm going to do it to manually invoke it. Okay, there we go. So hello, Andrew, and then it changes it. Bob. Pretty sweet. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let's move on then. Let's upgrade the next function. Right, this next function took in 2 inputs. Right, this is a Mad Lib's poem. Right, all it does is it takes 2 words and then outputs some poem. Right, I'm just gonna delete this for now. So let's upgrade this. I'm gonna do another interact. Right, we imported something called IPyWidgets, and this has access to a class function called interact. Right, so there we go, interact. And once again, the first argument represents the function that we're interacting with. Right, let's interact with the Mad Libs poem function. Okay, the next arguments represent the inputs to this function. There are two inputs in this function, adjective 1, adjective 2. Right, so adjective 1, adjective 2. But the syntax for this function requires that these have some default value. So I'm going to set this to a default value of an empty string, and same with the second input. All right, so let's go ahead and press enter. Okay, I just ran the cell, and we have two text boxes now. Right, these two widgets came from these two arguments. There's some magic happening in this function. Right? We'll talk about it in just a bit. Right? But we can fill in these adjectives, like we could say red, right, and then put blue here, and then we see that the event-driven programming updates this print statement. Right? It's pretty cool. We don't have to run the function over and over again. Right? This wrapper does it for us. All right. So we've written text widgets. Right? Text widgets mean that these are boxes that are expecting text. But let's deal with some different types of widgets. Right? These are called sliders. So going down to the bottom, right? You see how this calculate BMI one, right? This one is expecting numbers, right? Not really strings. Right? So let's wrap this function. Right? It's in. So I'm gonna make another cell right here. All right, and upgrade this so it's IPy widgets, which has access to an interact function, and we're gonna interact with the calculate BMI function. This has two inputs. Right? The two inputs are weight and height. Right? So I'm gonna put a weight and then height. Right? And once again, the syntax for this function requires that these inputs are set to some default value. Right? So I'm going to set it equal to some default value. Right? So earlier we did empty strings as values, right? But that's not going to make sense here, right? If we use an empty string as a default value, right, we won't be able to do math on strings, right? Just to kind of show that, right? See, I just ran the cell, and there's the text boxes, right? But then we get an error message. It says unsupported operand type for this right here. It's pretty much saying we can't do exponentiation with strings, right? So like if we did like 130 here and then 66 inches here, right? Nothing happens, right? Because these are technically text, right? Strings. So we're pretty much getting an error message right here, right? Where if we did 66 squared, right here, I'll show you what I mean. So pretty much the error message is like this. All right, 130, or no, it's 66 squared. Right, this is going to give us unsupported operand types, right, for string and int. Right, but we can do 66 squared without the double quotes because this is now an integer. Right, so once again, the first error message came from here, right, where that's what it's saying down here, right, unsupported operand types. So we don't want to use text boxes, right? Our default value should not be a string. It should probably be a number. All right, so let me just set it equal to some default number, like maybe 0 and 0. All right, so 0 and 0. That's our default number, meaning that when we run this function, right, we see there is a slider here that starts at 0. All right, see, and then we can drag it to 1. Oh, it looks like it only goes 0 to 1. But we're gonna make it better in just a bit. But our height also starts at 0, right, which gives us a division by 0 error. Right? This also makes sense because in Python, if you divide by 0, it's going to give you divide by 0 error. So 0 divided by 0, right? That gives us an error. So what if we set the denominator to 1? All right, so let's see. Boom, there we go. So now we started at 1, and our height is no longer 0, so it's not going to give us divide by 0 error. right? And then we can change the weight, and you see that our BMI changes, right? But our weight only can go from 0 to 1. That's because the magic in the background is kind of constrained, right? If we change this to like 130, and then maybe the height to some default number like 66, right? And we run this, it's going to give us a little more range because the in the background it's doing some magic where it's going to define the ranges for us. Right? So basically, these are our default values, 130 and 66, and we can change it. Right? We can interact with these two inputs. Right? Like if I weighed more, then my BMI changes accordingly. Right? And if I increase in height, then yeah, it changes as well. All right. Okay, people cool with this so far? Okay. Once again, this is a sneak peek into the next lesson. All right. I do want to expand on the magic that's happening in the background before we jump into the lesson. All right, so let me just scroll back up to the top. Okay, back to the top, we did a greet function, right? And all this greet function did was repeat a name out. And in our interact cell, you remember how we said name is equal to an empty string? That there is some magic happening on this piece right here, right? Name is equal to empty string. This is where a widget is being defined, right? It's called a text box widget. So there are tons of widgets. Right? You can actually look at the documentation for this. So I'm going to go ahead and Google it. I'm going to Google IPy widgets in the list just to see what we have access to. So there is the primary documentation. Okay, there are tons of widgets. Right? In particular, we dealt with string widgets right here. So I'm just going to click on here. Right? We dealt with string widgets. This is a text, right? Text box, which allows us to type in things. Right? That's what we have so far. So we can actually do it manually. Right? The magic that's happening in the background is that this string, this empty string, is being resolved into something called ipywidgets.text. Right? So this might be a little hard to read, but earlier there was an empty string here. Right? It's actually being implicitly resolved to this empty text box. Right, so I'll go ahead and run it, and you see it's the same thing. Here, actually, let me make another cell so people see what's happening. So this line is the same as this one, right? But instead of an empty string, we're going to say ipywidgets.text. So these two are the same, right? This one and this one, same thing. All right, so that's the magic, right? And similarly on the Mad Libs poem, right, let's do the same exact thing, right? There are two things happening in the background that we don't see, right? These two widgets are being implicitly resolved to two different text boxes, right? So this is going to be the same as this right here, but instead of the empty string, ipywidgets.text. And then this one is the same too, ipywidgets.text. Okay, so I'm going to run this. It gives us the same thing, right? See, same exact thing as up here. So yeah, if folks are wondering how I knew this, I looked up the widget lists, and there are so many different widgets. We're only going to touch like 3 of them, but we're really going to touch text boxes, sliders, and selection widgets. I mean, just a few of them. It might be easier to read if we display this function call on multiple lines. Like it might be easier to read if we put each input on its own separate line. This is arguably easier to read. Right? We got first input that represents the function we're interacting with, and then the inputs right here. So this is easier to read in my opinion. Okay, let's talk about one more magic thing. Right? This BMI calculator doesn't use a text box. Right? You see how here, these are sliders. And so this is actually coming from a widget. It's called numeric widgets. So if I scroll to numeric widgets here, there are a couple sliders. There's an integer slider. Right? Integer slider means that there's no decimals. And then there is a float slider, which do support decimals. Right? So the magic in the background is the numbers here are being implicitly resolved to a float slider, or no, it's being implicitly resolved to a integer slider. Right? You see how when we slide it, there's no decimals in between. So if we wanted to do this more explicitly, right, we can write the same exact thing, right? But instead of hard coding the number, we can say it is a integer slider, and then same with this height, int slider. Oh, it comes from this library, ipywidgets. Okay, and I'm just going to make this easier to read by putting all of these inputs on separate lines. Okay, there we go. This looks easier to read. There we go. And then, yeah, you see it gives us the same thing, right? But once again, we're getting a divide by zero error, right? So this is a little ahead, but these integer sliders are actually functions that can take more arguments. Like we can specify the default value, right? See how here the default value starts at 0. So we can change it, and then now we won't get a division by zero error anymore. Right? We can actually change the range of here, right? Like you see how the range goes from 0 to 100. And that's a little constrained because people might weigh more than 100 pounds. So this widget is constrained, right? And the same with this height, right? It's only from 0 to 100, right? So we can change this widget settings. I'm just going to look at the documentation again. So for a integer slider, we can specify 2 more arguments, right? The min and max, which represents the range. So I'm just going to go ahead and represent the range here. Like say min is equal to 1, right? Meaning that the least someone can weigh is 1 pound, and maybe the max, let's just say 300. Right? It doesn't matter too much. And the same with the height, right? I'm just gonna use the same thing. Min is 1, max is equal to 300, right? This will define a range. So now our sliders go from 1 to 300. Right? So I can change it to my own weight, which is 130, and then the height, which is about 66 inches. There we go. And there is my BMI. All right. People cool with this so far? I know this is a lot to digest right now, but all we did was write 3 different functions and wrap them. Right? We wrapped them in a interact function. Right? And this wrapper allows us to not invoke our functions manually. Right? The widgets will invoke it for us. That's the cool part about today. Okay, any questions before we jump into the lesson? This was a nice sneak peek, right? All right, let's jump into the lesson. It's going to be a really small one, and then we'll do the lab in just a bit. So lesson on interactivity, number 11. All right, let's load that up. Okay. So yeah, event-driven programming, right? This is when our program is responding to things as they happen, right? We won't have to invoke the function manually. Right? We can have another function do it for us. All right. So first, I'm going to import this ipywidgets in this lesson so we can use it. Okay, ipywidgets, run that cell. Okay. We've seen a couple of widgets already. All right, let's see a couple more. I'm just going to comment these lines out so we can run it one at a time. All right, so we've seen text boxes, we've seen integer sliders. Here's a button. Right, so here's a button right here. Click me. Right, so far it does nothing because we never programmed it to do something. But if you're curious what this button is, it's a Boolean value. Right? Basically, when we click it, it returns true. And then this next one is a checkbox. Right? This can also be thought of as a Boolean. Right? If this is clicked, then it's true. If it's not clicked, it's false. Right? And then we've seen text boxes here too. Right? Text boxes. This is a string. Right? We can type in any text into it. Okay. So once again, these are just widgets that can be used as input to a function. Right, earlier in the sneak peek, we saw over here, right? These are widgets, right? These we're using this widget to input data into this variable weight. Right, and same with this one. We're using another widget to go into here. Right, so that's what we're seeing here. These are just more stuff we can use. Right? In particular, this one will allow us to input booleans, right, true or false, and this one will allow us to input text or strings. Right, there are tons of it. Right, we're just going to see a few of them. Okay, let's deal with this very general function right here. This function is called hello interact. All it does is it describes the input. Right, that's all it does. We see that the f string, right, it's just describing the type and the value. Right, so let's just see what this does. Right, so if we put in 100, 100 will be substituted into a, and then the function will return a string that describes what it is. Right, so let's see, what's the type of a? Right, this should be an integer, right, a whole number, and then the value should just be a, 100. Right, so we see that it returns the f string. Right, it's a type class int, and then it's a value 100. Right, once again, all this is doing is describing the input. And so I could do another one, right? Like, let's just say hello interact. Let me just put in a list here, like a list of 2 words. Right? This is a list, right? The input is a list, and the value are these 2 things right here. Right? That's all the function is doing, just telling us what the input are. So let's go ahead and interact with it. Right? We're going to interact with this function right here. Right, so interact, right, comes from this library called ipywidgets, and then the first argument, right, it represents the function that we're interacting with, and then the second represents the input. In this case, we're setting the input equal to some integer. Right, so this is going to give us an integer slider. Right, and once again, it's because there is some magic happening here. Right, this default value 100 is being implicitly resolved to an integer slider. Right, so if folks are wondering, in the background, this is happening right here. Right, the second argument is becoming ipywidgets.int slider. Right, and it's actually setting the default value to 100. Right, so let me look at the documentation to see how to set the default value. So let's see, int slider, looks like default value is right here. So I can say default value is equal to 100. And so now these 2 lines are the same exact thing. There's some magic happening there. All right. Okay. All right, people cool with this so far? Make this easier to read. All right, same thing. I just like to do this one because it's more explicit, because you can have more control over the widget. So this interact function can work with multiple types of widgets, right? Let's play around with different ones. Right? So far, we only have an integer slider here, right? But we can use different ones, right? Like a float slider. Right? So this one right here, I'm going to type it in. ipywidgets.interact and interact with this function. But let's say we're going to use a different widget, right? So I'll say a is equal to 10.5, right? This is not going to give us an integer widget because 10.5 is not an integer, right? It's going to implicitly resolve it to a float slider, meaning that we can do decimals in between, right? So the magic that's happening here is that this second argument is being implicitly resolved to a float slider, ipywidgets.float slider. And then it's setting the default value to 10.5. Right, so that's going to be the same exact thing as here. See, same thing, default at 10.5, and we can change it. Okay, let me put this on separate lines, make it easier to read. Right, so we've seen integer sliders and float sliders. Right, let's play with a little more. Right, like I'm just going to make another cell. Right, like maybe folks were wondering about the checkbox. Right, like remember up in the first couple cells there was a checkbox. Right, let's play around with this one right here. So I'm going to copy and paste this checkbox and use this instead. And let's see what happens. All right, once again, this should be a Boolean, right? Whether or not it's clicked. So I'm just going to rewrite this. Let's do another one. So ipywidgets.interact. Right, we're going to interact with the same function. Right, but this time we're going to say a is equal to some checkbox. Right, so a is equal to this right here. I just copied this from above. Right, so let's see what this gives us. Okay, there we go. So we ran it, and now we're interacting. Right, we see that the input is a type Boolean, right, meaning that when we click it, it's going to give us true, and when we uncheck it, it'll give us false. Right. All right. Okay. All right, so we've seen integer sliders, we've seen checkboxes. Let's do the string, the text box as well. Right, a text box, if we set the default value to some string, right, it should give us a place where we can type things in. All right, ipywidget.interact, and then hello interact. Okay, I'm going to set a equal to some default string, your name here. Right, this means when we run it, right, it's going to immediately type in this default string for us. Right, and we see that the function is just telling us what it is. Right, your name here. I can put Andrew here. This is going to change it. Put a 100. Right, this is still a string, by the way. Okay. And again, the magic that's happening, right? This string is being implicitly resolved to a text box, right? It's actually going to look like ipywidgets.text, right? So that's what's happening in the background. And maybe there's a default value. Let me look at the documentation to see how to specify this default value. So let me look at the widget list over here. And let me go to the string widgets. String widgets. Okay, we can specify the default value by saying a value. Right, so all that's happening here is the default value is being set to your name here. Right, same thing. So I'm just going to put on multiple lines. There we go. Same thing. So I'm going to run this, and yeah, see, it's interacting with it now. Okay, so put hello here, and it changes. All right. All right, so all we're doing right now are using different types of widgets to visualize what's being input. Right, like if we use a integer slider, right, an integer is being input, right? We see that the class type here is an integer, right? We can use a float slider and it will give us a float. Same with a checkbox, right? We use a checkbox here. It gives us a checkbox that allows us to input a Boolean, something that's true or false. And then finally, we've seen a string input. Right? We've seen a string input right here using the text widget. Okay. Finally, we can use a pull-down menu. Right? A pull-down menu is resolved from a list. Right? So if we gave a list as a default value, so .interact, interact, right? If we gave a default value of some list, right? I'm just gonna put in a couple things here. Santa Cruz, Capitola, Watsonville. All right, let me just put this on multiple lines again. Right, if we gave this one a list, it's going to implicitly resolve this list into something called a drop-down menu. Right, this drop-down where we can click on multiple things. Right, these are strings because the list items are strings. Right, so this is a selection widget. I'm just going to pull up the documentation. Right, the selection widget over here. Selection widget. Right, we're using something called a drop-down. All right. And then finally the checkbox. Oh, yeah, we already did this. Basically, if you set it to Boolean, it's going to give us a checkbox. It's going to implicitly resolve this to the checkbox. Hello, interact. And A is equal to some Boolean. This gives us checkbox, which is of type Boolean. All right, so with that in mind, I think we have enough to do the lab. Right, this might have been information overload, but let's focus on the integer sliders for now. Right, the first question in the lab is using an integer slider. Right, so just be comfortable with these first two over here. Right, we use an integer slider and a float slider down here. All right, let's load up the lab and apply some of this stuff. So the lab is in right here, lab 11. Okay, we're gonna spend like 10-15 minutes on the first two questions. I'm gonna give an intermission in just a bit. So yeah, the first part is asking us to write a function that just really returns a sum of two arguments. Right? And then once you write that function, there is an interact command here that should verify if it worked. Right? So once you write this function, test it. Right? So yeah, go ahead and give that a shot. And then for number two, this one's a tiny bit trickier. This one is not going to use integers. It's going to use strings. Right? So you're going to have two text boxes here. But yeah, it's already written for you. Right? Pretty much if you finish the function, then this interact button widgets should be generated accordingly. Okay, so once again, we should have enough to do number one and number two. Right? Nothing in part two yet. We can focus on this stuff later. Right? Part two is using the turtle. But let's do part one, right? All together. Right? I'll give it like 10-15 minutes, and then after that intermission, I will go over it. Right? But yeah, go ahead and give it a shot. So I have some tips. So some tips is, define the function here. Right? So define it here. and then maybe test it yourself, right? Like in the next cell, I just created another cell, right? So create another cell and then manually invoke it here, right? So manually invoke the function here, right? This is to test its accuracy. So manually invoke the function, and once you tested its accuracy and verified that the function works as intended, then this next cell should be able to interact with it. Right? This is same with this number two. Right? Number two, you want to define the function here, but then let's make another cell. Right? Make another cell that manually invokes it. So I'm just going to copy and paste this right here. Manually invoke the function. Right? And once you've verified that the function works, this next cell should generate the widgets accordingly. All right, yeah, go ahead and give it a shot, and I'll be back in 10-15 minutes to go over this. But yeah, please try it yourself. Okay, welcome back from intermission, everyone. Hope y'all gave the first problem a try. And so make sure we import this library so we can use it in a bit. All right, so this first one, we actually did this last week. Right, last week on the functions lesson, we wrote a function that takes two inputs and returns the result. Right, so it's going to be the same. Right, it's just going to have a different name. So add ints, and it takes two inputs. Right, this question asks us to have an A and an B. Okay, next it needs to take those two inputs and return the sum. Right, so I'm just going to store it into result A plus B, right, and then return the result. Right, so that's all we need there. So let's go ahead and test it before we do the widgets. Right, once again, the widget is already written for us, but we want to manually invoke it. So let's manually invoke it. Here, I'm just going to test its accuracy by typing in add ints and then type in two, just some test numbers like 2 and then 6. Right, this should return 8. Okay, there we go. We got 8, and it's looking good, right? We can keep testing. All right, 1 and 5, right, gives us 6. Okay, so once again, this is the return value from here. Right, once you have this done, right, this next cell will create the widgets for you. Right, see, it's going to interact with the function that we just wrote, but these two inputs, A and B, will have default values of integer 10 and integer 20. So we go ahead and run that. We see, there we go, right? It has two widgets, and yeah, 10 and 20, right? So we can drag it, and it's going to change the sum. Right? Pretty cool, right? See, we don't have to manually invoke the function. This does it for us. Every time we make an event, I see these are all events. Right? Every event that happens, it will recall the function for us. Okay. And once again, you don't have to do this. I'm more of a fan of doing things more explicitly. So this technically is implicitly resolved to an integer slider. Right? So this is being resolved into ipywidgets.int slider, where the default value is equal to 10. Right? And then same with the next one. Right? This is, in my opinion, a little better because we have more control over the widget. And then this one was a default value of 20. Right, same thing. Okay, and once again, we do have more control over this, just because if you look at the primary documentation, you can configure a lot of things within the widget. Right? Here, we're only configuring the default value, right? But you can configure other things like the range, the description. Yeah, you can change a bunch of things. All right, so that was the first one. Okay, the second one is a little trickier because we're dealing with text boxes. All right, so this one we want to write a function that takes two inputs and generates a link from it. Right, in this case, it's going to be a review of the HTML from a couple weeks ago. Right, so that's why it's a little trickier. So if we wanted to find a function called hyperlink, okay, and it takes two inputs, right? Both of these are going to be strings, right? So URL and then text. Okay, let me just docstring this, right, so people see what the function is going to do. Right, this will generate an HTML object. Right, we haven't talked about objects yet, but we'll talk about it towards the end of the semester. But this is just a fancy HTML string. So it's going to generate an HTML object um, that represents a link. Right, there's going to be two inputs here. Right, the first input is the URL, which is a string that represents the link. A string, so it's URL. It's like here. Right? This is a URL. It's an address, and then the second one is a text. Right, it's another string um, that represents a text. Right, the difference is the text is like a word, and then when we click on that text, it'll bring us to the URL. And that's what's going to happen here. And then finally, the output, right? It's going to return an HTML object with the hyperlink, with a clickable hyperlink. Okay, so let's get this done. A couple of weeks ago, we've been storing HTML in strings, right? You might have remembered we did like my HTML is equal to something, right? This is typically what we did, a multi-line string to represent the HTML. Right? You don't have to do multi-line, but I'm going to do it anyways, just because it's easier to read. And you might remember that we represented it, the string, right? So here the string, it's going to be a href is equal to some other string, right? And then the closing tag is going to be just the /a. Right? Once again, this is stuff from a couple weeks ago. Right? So a link uses these tags. Right? In particular, the URL is going to go within these quotes. So we should probably use an f string here so we can interpolate this variable into here. So I'm going to change this to an f string and then interpolate the URL into here. And then next, the text. Right, the text is going to be the thing that we can click on. All right, so there is our HTML, and now we can go ahead and return it. Right, we generated it, so let's return it. So I'm just going to return my HTML. But the quick little twist to this is the question wanted to be an HTML object. So we have to wrap this in a HTML wrapper. This way we can display it later. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. So I'm just going to run this function, right, and then invoke it. So I'll go hyperlink. Okay, and then it needs two inputs, right? The address and then the text. Right, so I'm just going to hard code a couple things here, like maybe the class homepage, right? So I'll say class. Wait, no. This is the second one. Right? The second argument is class homepage, right? And then the first argument is the URL that will bring us to there. Right? So in this case, I'm just going to copy this URL from the canvas. So copy and paste, and then paste it right here. All right, so let's see what this does. Right, this should give us some return value. Right? Oh, okay, we got an error actually. So let's study this error. It says name HTML is not defined. This probably means that we didn't import the HTML library. So I think we need to import something before we run the function. I think it's, I got to look at the previous lesson, but it's, let me look at the previous lesson. Right here, from ipython.display import HTML. This will let us use the HTML wrapper. Okay, there we go, and paste. Okay, and I'm going to rerun this cell. Okay, so now our manual invocation should work. Okay, there we go. So we just ran this hyperlink, and the output, right, the return value was this HTML object. Right? We can click on it, and it'll bring us to here, right, the web page. So now we can use this next cell to test it. Right, this next cell is going to create two widgets. Right, it's going to create two text widgets. One is going to allow us to type in the URL, and then the next one will let us type in the text. So I'm going to put this on separate lines just to make it look easier to read. It is a pretty long line. Okay, and run it. And there we go, right? We have two text boxes. Right? Basically, whenever we update these, it's going to change this link right here. Right? So currently, the default value brings us to the original author for this notebook. Right? So lifealgorithmic.com. This is Mike Matera's website. So I'll go here, and then it brings us to here. That's the original author for this class. Right? But we can change it. Right? Like I can change the link. Right? So I'm going to use our Canvas link. Right, there we go. Just pasted the link, and then an event happened. Right, so the event changed this link. Right, so now if I click here, it brings us to the here. Right, the class web page, and then we can change this text too. This is a second text box. So I'm just put like hello, right, and we see that it changes the output. Right, so this is pretty sick. Right, it's manually, oh, no, it's not manually, it's automatically calling our function whenever we make an event, like whenever we update the text boxes. All right. Okay, once again, there is a magic happening here. Right? I do prefer something called an explicit way. Right? But basically, it's doing some automatic things. This string is being resolved into a text, a widget text. And same with the second one. Right? So you don't have to do this, but an equivalent way is to just to say that this is a text box, right? You say it's a widget, and then text, and same with right here. All right, there we go. And then, yeah, same thing, right? The only difference is there are no default values. Right? So once we populate it, right, it should generate it. So let's populate it. I'm just going to get the link here, URL, and then say something like class homepage. Right? See, it populated it because now the HTML string contains the data. Pretty sweet, right? Yeah, this is some pretty cool stuff. I know there are some website designers in this class. So for those, feel free to come see me because it is possible to embed these widgets into your own website and make it more interactive. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. Okay, so we're done with part one. Okay, I think we can actually do part two now. So we didn't finish the lesson yet. At the lesson, we got all the way down to here. Let's see, over here, right? We got to here where there's many awesome widgets that we can use, like choose a color and choose a date. I'm gonna skip over this. Well, this is not too important, but folks can try this by themselves. These are pretty much fancier widgets, like this one will allow us to use a color picker. So we can click here and then choose any color we want. Okay, and then there's a date picker right here too. This is a calendar. Right, so it's going to generate a calendar. So boom, and then there's our calendar. We can click it and choose our date. Pretty cool stuff. It's not too important. This is just fancier things if you want to implement it. But for the sake of this lesson, right, we're just going to stick with the sliders and the text boxes. Right, so I'm also going to skip over the decorators here. Right, this is not too important. Pretty much all we really need to know is how to do integer sliders, right? Like these over here, these sliders, and also the text boxes where we can type things in. Right? That's really all we need to know for this lesson. Everything else down here, like the decorators, this is just fancier stuff if you want to make things more automatic. But yeah, I'm not gonna go over decorators too much. Maybe in a couple days, but this is not too important stuff. It's just fancier things. So let's jump back into the lab. I think we're gonna finish the rest of this lab together, and then end kind of early. So we're gonna be done in like maybe 10 minutes, and then in the next couple of days, on Wednesday, I mean, we'll go over hints for the next assignment. Okay. So let's see. Remember we did a triangle. Oh, once again, I'm on the lab. Remember last week we wrote a triangle function, which pretty much moved a turtle 3 different times. Right, so we wrote this last week, and if we were to manually invoke it, right, we could just say triangle like 50. Right? Oh, okay, it should have drew something. I forgot to do a new, right? tu.new. This will declare a canvas. So let's declare a canvas and then run it. Right, we see that we called the triangle and it drew it, and we can go 100 and it draws it bigger. We can go 200. Right, we can manually change this. Right, but wouldn't it be more convenient if we wrapped this function? Right, like if we were to wrap this function and allow us a slider to update the triangle for us. Right, maybe we should use some sort of number slider, right? Like maybe an integer slider or a float slider. It doesn't matter too much, but I'm going to use an integer slider. So that's the point of this next cell right here, right? Make the function interactive. So we can make interactive by calling the interact function, right? Interact. Right? And what do we want to interact with? The triangle function, right? Triangle function. And then the next argument represents the input to triangle. Right? In this case, the input is a size. Right? You can think of size as maybe an integer or a float. Right? I'm going to probably use an integer just to keep it simpler. Right? So size, I'm going to set it equal to some integer slider. Right? So size is equal to ipywidgets.int slider. Okay, and let's test it. So run it, and there we go. So we have a slider that starts at a default value of 0, and we can drag it. Right, so when we drag it, you see how the triangle on top is getting bigger? Right, pretty sick, right? Yeah, so every time we make an event, it's going to automatically call the triangle function for us. That's what this is letting us do. Okay. All right. And then finally, we'll do this one together. Typically, I let folks try it out themselves. But if you're on the recording, feel free to pause it and try it out yourself. All right, so let's do this one together, and then we'll end class. This final one, right, wants us to make this function interactive. Right, so the function is already written for us. Right? all we need to do is wrap it inside the interact function. Right, so just to kind of talk about what this function does, right? It takes two arguments and then it'll display in a certain way, right? So if we look at the resulting f string, right? Basically, the contents are being printed, right? But then the tags will allow us to specify the style of it. For example, if we were to manually invoke the function, right? Like my tag, and let's say I give it like a bold. Whoops. Let's say I give it a bold tag, right? Like B, and then let's say I put a hello world as the contents, right? You see, it returned an HTML object that's hello world but bolded. Right? Once again, that's because hello world is being substituted into here, right? And then the B is being substituted into these tags, right? Which will make the style of it. So I'm gonna let me make this look easier to read, just because this is in a single line and it could be arguably harder to read. So typically I like to store things in a variable. This way you can fix it later. Right, so I'm just going to store it in here, rewrite this. Right, it's a multi-line f string where we have a tag, right, and then the ending tag. This is we're interpolating the variable, right, and then inside of the tags is our plain text, or the text that we're going to be displaying. Right, so this HTML string is the same as over here. Right, so I'm just going to replace this with my HTML. This is a little more modular and easier to read in my opinion. So I'll run this and you see it's the same thing. Oh, we got an error right here. So name content is not defined. Let's see. I think I spelled content wrong. So this should be plural because our arguments, because this is plural, right? The input name. So I'm just going to make this an S as well. Okay, it should work now. So run this. Right, and once again, we can manually invoke the function and keep changing it. Like if I use I, this will be italics. Right, and if I use U, this is underline. This is stuff from a couple weeks ago. Some styling. All right. So there we go. We manually invoke the function. Right, this is manually invoke the function. Now we can make it interactive. Right? In this case, we want to interact with two of the inputs. Right? The first input is a tag, and then the next one is the text that we're displaying. So maybe we could start off with strings, right? Like you see how these are strings. So maybe we could write a couple input widgets that will allow us to type in a string, right? Like maybe we could interact with it. ipywidgets.interact. Right, we're interacting with this function, my tag, and then we have two inputs. Right, the first input is the tag, and the second one is the contents. Right, so tag and then contents. Right, but we need to give it some default value. Right, that's the syntax for this interact function. It requires that these have some default value. So I'm just going to set it equal to like an empty string for now. This way the widgets will be implicitly resolved to a text cell. Right, so then when we run it, we have two widgets. Right, there's nothing in it here because we didn't populate it yet. Right, but we put B as a tag and then like hello. Right, we see that it'll update it for us. Right, it's calling this function and generating the HTML string for us. Right, and we can say I for italics, U for underline. All right. The only difference that we should make now is we want the user to choose between these three choices. right? So this widget doesn't really let the user choose. It's kind of letting them type it in manually. Um, if we wanted to choose between three choices, you might have seen in the lesson there was a drop-down menu. Right? A drop-down menu in this previous lesson was specified by a list. Right? If we set the default value equal to some list, it'll produce us a drop-down menu. Right? So let's use that. So let's go back here, and then instead of having the tag be an empty string, right? If we set it to a list, it'll implicitly resolve this to a drop-down menu. Right? So I'll set it a list of B, and then I, and then U. Right? So we start out B, we can say like hello, right? And then we can change this tag, and then it'll change it as we want. Right, so pretty cool stuff. So I'm just gonna put this on multiple lines. Okay, there we go. So yeah, once again, uh, this first widget is a drop-down menu because the list is implicitly resolved as the drop-down menu. And then this second widget is a string, a text box. Right? So yeah, that's about it for here. I hope folks found this interesting. This is a pretty short lesson. Yeah, we're pretty much done with it. Right? Once again, I'm going to skip over the rest of this lesson. It's not too important. It's just fancier things. Right? So this is just for people who are more interested. Right? So we're pretty much done with this lesson. I'm going to skip over everything down here, like decorators and then global widgets. Yeah, it's not too important for now. The important thing is writing functions. And then this lesson is kind of just wrapping the function and letting us call the function over and over again. All right, so we're actually done with the lesson 11, right, lesson 11, and also the lab 11. Right, so we're gonna end like half an hour early today, but as some closing thoughts, in a couple of days, we're going to go over hints for the next assignment. So there is another assignment out. It's called HTML weather functions. This is probably one of the trickier assignments. So on Wednesday, we're probably going to spend like half an hour just going over how to do it. So come through Wednesday, and we'll give folks some starter code on this next assignment. Other than that, we're going to end early today. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and feel free to stick around with the time remaining. Have a great day, folks.